This is a revision of Bayonet Charge, going over the poem as a whole, but also developing ideas about it in depth. Bayonet Charge is a very useful poem for your GCSE exam. It particularly works with, obviously, war poetry, and this is an example, like Remains, of somebody experiencing war on an individual level, and like War Photographer and Poppies as well, although they don't deal with the soldier's experience. It deals with issues of isolation, it deals with the emotional strain, and you could certainly argue that it's attempting to deal with the reality of war. Now, as far as what it helps us to know goes, well, we are talking contextual information, but remember, of course, contextual information should not be bolted onto an answer, just things that help us to understand where Hughes may be going. Already know. For example, knowing what a bayonet is, and particularly understanding that a bayonet is something that can be used or is used in close contact with your enemy. The idea that bayonets are generally associated with the First World War, even though not exclusively, as is the idea of running, towards the enemy. We tend to think of that way. And Hughes has family links to the First World War as well. However, it does seem that the poem is really more about war in general than anything specific and any specific wars. He doesn't choose to mention or bring it up. And then it's important for us to note, because it comes up several times in here, that idea that many soldiers did sign up for the First World War. I'm talking particularly civilians signing up to for conscription of soldiers for patriotic reasons. This idea for king and country. Okay, to in the poem. It starts with this soldier running across the battlefields towards the enemy while bullets fly past him. He does have a rifle, but he feels it's useless. His patriotic reasons for joining the war just fall away because he becomes terrified. So immediately we get that contrast coming in between what he thought he was going to experience and what he does experience. Then, as he runs, we're taken further in that strange second stanza into him going more philosophical, thinking about why he's actually there, beginning to ponder bigger issues before the horrific sight of a hair on fire brings him back to the reality of where he is, and he continues running, feeling nothing at all but terror. You see how terror is right at the heart of this. Okay, let's take the title to begin with, as we always do here. Let's consider this idea of a bayonet then that we've just been mentioning. To use a bayonet, you have to be in the intimacy of battle. I mean, we're talking about not shooting from a distance. We're talking about killing someone, looking them in the eyes. You have to be pretty close to them to be able to kill them with a bayonet. Now, although he doesn't kill anyone with a bayonet in here, and there is no one else mentioned, it does suggest he's on his way to do that. So think to yourself why Hughes has made this suggestion. And then add to it potentially the word charge. I know it's used as a noun here, a bayonet charge, but think of the verb charge. Think of what it means, particularly within a war context, to charge. What kind of an action this is, reckless, wild, enthusiastic. We've already had that word in Charge of the Light Brigade earlier in the anthology. You could argue it's in a very different, well, not necessarily a different way, but has a very different impact here. So think carefully. That initial title seems to be Hughes placing us very clearly in terms of what's coming, what's about to happen, maybe the horror of what's coming already, and even where he's heading towards at the end of the poem. Okay, so let's deal with stanza 1 first of all, and let's start right with this strange phrase, suddenly he awoke and was running. Now, Obviously, this begins with that term in media res, or media res, depending how you pronounce it, in the middle of things, literally. The idea that we are starting in the middle of the action. Hughes has made this choice not to give us the preparation for the charge, for the attack, not to give us the orders, not to give us the nerves as he comes to start his run. Instead, he starts us in the middle. But this idea of waking and finding yourself running is something I don't think we want to necessarily ignore. Think what this means, that he was suddenly awake. Now, some interpret this as him almost being asleep on the battlefield, that something has happened before that's taken him out of himself, a bit like he does in the second stanza here. And then he comes back to it and finds himself running, which in itself is obviously a very detached process. He's not actively running, he finds he's just doing it. Others, though, and I would take this interpretation very much as an examiner, if we were dealing with something like the power of memory or whatever, suggest that this shows us he survives, and this is him revisiting this. And the fact that his memories keep coming back. Now, if you do take that interpretation, do notice it's not that he was dreaming of running. It's that he woke up and discovers he's running. Now, that could easily be that middle ground. He wakes and finds himself back in that place running. When he wakes up, it's had such an impact on him. But definitely consider the opening line there, the decision to start us with that, the suddenness of it, and the idea of what has happened and what's led him here. Idea of running, and we throw in some of the other verbs in the opening bit, or verbs, participles. You see a number of actions here: running, stumbling, hearing, smacking, sweating, which I would argue are very visceral verbs, okay? What you want to do is look at them and consider them as representing the soldier's state of mind at the beginning, okay? That he's stumbling, that he's sweating, that he's, when he's running, he's stumbling, that he's sweating, that the bullets around him are something he's hearing rather than anything else. Think of the terror that would go with, and that phrase smacking to describe the sound that the bullets make. So see how the actions, the physicality is being used. Now, taking in that stumbling idea a bit further, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire. I mentioned this very briefly, I think, earlier, that he doesn't have, he says isolation. So the idea that he is so isolated, despite the fact that he is actually obviously on a battlefield surrounded by other soldiers and an enemy firing at him. In the poem, nobody else is presented. Even here, when he's being attacked, it's written, as it suggests here, as though nature is attacking him rather than the enemy soldiers. The hedge is almost shooting at him. Now, it's obvious it isn't, but again, think about the choice of presenting it to us that way. And when you do look at that, he's stumbling across a field of clods, a very awkward, movement, very, there's nothing heroic about that going across the middle there. But the hedge is, it's described as green. It's made clear that it's green. Generally something that's just in health, maybe, of something natural, or emphasising the nature. Take how you want from it. And again, the use of the word dazzling with rifle fire. Again, another word that, although it gives us the impression of the sight, it does introduce that sense that there's something spectacular going on here. So his awkwardness seems contrasted with something a little bit more spectacular and interesting coming from the other side. So think about that message, about the situation that's being put across here. Now, the shooting, the rifle has just been mentioned before, and the shooting that's happening from the enemy towards him. Now here's his rifle. But it's described very clearly as useless. Now look at the language that's being used here. Okay? Yeah, lugging something suggests like a dead weight being having to drag behind you. But then we have this simile that the rifle to him feels numb as a smashed arm. And this is the question I ask you here. Why compare that rifle to a broken arm? Now, I suppose, think to yourself, what's the value of an arm? What do you use your arms for? What do you use a rifle for? If your arm is broken, it's useless and you can't do that anymore. If your rifle feels numb as a broken arm, then it should be like an arm, but it's broken. It's smashed. And again, I would think about the exaggeration of smashed rather than just broken as well to go with it. Don't ever get confused and think he's talking about his arm being smashed. At this point, remember, it is the rifle. And he is talking about numbness, a lack of feeling that's coming there. So take that simile and think to yourself, yeah, the rifle is useless, but why that choice of comparison? Finally, in stanza 1, the last couplet at the end, which goes back to this idea of patriotism. Okay? Yep, it seems, says there, he originally joined up for patriotic reasons. But these reasons are now reduced to the adrenaline and panic or the sweat of the moment. Yeah, that seems to be what this simile and metaphor as well early on there seems to be suggesting. He'd been crying for patriotic reasons when he signed up, and that tear is now transferred into adrenaline and panic. Now, the interesting thing here, though, is that simile again here. It's sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. Now, why molten iron in the centre of his chest? Iron in your chest, it tends to make you think in war of a bullet, doesn't it? But I mean, molten? Melting iron? Why does it seem like there's melting iron or melted iron in the middle of his chest? Try and link it in, I would say, to the sense of terror and panic that Hughes has created so far, and maybe even the numbness and awkwardness that's there. But think about this being the reality of the situation at the end. He's summing this up very much. Now, stanza 1 takes, but then stanza 2 moves into something much, much more complex, where he seems to retreat inside his head to ideas. He almost stopped. The terror's gone to bewilderment. Think of the difference in those two words, just sheer terror, which will come back at the end, of course, but then go into confusion. And that make him seem like he's about to stop. Now, of course, he doesn't stop, but it's feeling like it does. Now, the question I've asked you there to think of is this idea of the shift at this point. We've just had the patriotic tear turning into sweat on his chest. And it's at this point, particularly then, he goes from terror to bewilderment. Why now go to his thoughts from the surface feelings that we had before? Now, when you answer that question, it should lead you into this, again, very strange metaphor we've got here. The cold clockwork of the stars and the nations. And he asks himself the question, in what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? It seems very jumbled up in its words. He seems to be identifying himself as the hand of a clock. Okay? And by pointing that second, maybe the second hand of a clock. And he seems to be the second hand of a clock in a clockwork progression of the stars and the nations. The stars, the heavens above, and the nations, the earth below, and particularly the nations, of course, who are fighting in war. So I think the best way to look at this is as it says there, if he is the hand in the clockwork of the heavens and the nations below, what is that saying about war in general? And particularly, what's it saying about the impact of war on an individual? And if that clockwork then does stretch to the nations, I was saying there, think what that's suggesting about the role of countries and governments in war. Okay, we move back to a very, even though it's very much in his thoughts, a very visceral idea here to try and describe his running. I think it's deliberately confusing to get across his confusion here. You know, running like a man who's jumped up in the dark and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reasons of his still running. The repetitive use of running and runs, along with jumped up and then listening for a reason to his footfalls, I think is deliberately trying to get across that idea of confusion. But if we unpack it, you can still see the confusion he's feeling. Okay, as it says there, it's a man who doesn't understand why he's jumped up and begun running. Okay, imagine that. You jump up and begin running. Why did I just do that? And the only way you can find out is to listen to the silence between your footsteps to come up with a reason to explain why you are running. And then it's in the dark. So it definitely seems to be a quest for meaning at this point. Okay. And again, it's another example of him being detached, his actions, his movements being detached from what he sees as his self. But the other question I go for here really is take on board that quest for meaning, and then remember that Hughes abruptly ends this by bringing in the burning hair. You know, the first and third stanzas are 8 lines long, quite standard length for a stanza. Easily dividable up into pairs or fours. It works. But stanza 2 is only 7 lines, and even that is interrupted in the middle of the 7th line. I think clearly Hughes seems to be showing us that the hair interrupts these thoughts. So therefore come back to this idea. He's interrupting the guy's quest for meaning and bringing him back to reality. There is something you can draw out there about the on him. Take that and use that shot/fires bit as part of stanza 3, and let's take the yellow hair. My argument is certainly that this will be the most disturbing part of the poem. Okay, and I think it's very, very interesting that Hughes is choosing to use a hair rather than a human, because it could quite easily be here, couldn't it? That the shot/fires threw up a soldier on fire that rolls like a flame and crawls about, his mouth wide open sign. It could easily be done. But to use a hair, something natural, being put in an unnatural situation by the humans around it, and to use, as it says there, details that are like something out of a horror film. The mouth wide open silent, the eyes standing out. It's a heck of a place to choose a real impact like that, an impact moment like this. And when you link in the moment it's interrupted, you link in that it's about a hair, you link in the horror of it, it then takes us quite naturally into what he's about to do, because he just plunges past, and that word plunge as well at the same time. Not runs, but plunging past again, like the charge at the beginning, almost like something wild, a lack of control. And at this point, with everything that's happened, he's reached this point where we get this list of things that used to matter to him apparently falling away in his terror. And it gets worse as the list goes on. So we start with the king, the patriotism, honour, the kind of human quality that probably made him feel he wanted to join up, before we go down to human dignity. And the question I ask you there is, think of the impact of calling human dignity a luxury. Basic human dignity becoming a luxury. That is most definitely bringing to us the state he's in, and it's very much further on from the sweating like molten iron earlier on. Just the pure terror that was there. Human dignity becoming a luxury. Then, as well as I love the image of the blue crackling air, we come to the final line. Very, very heavily impacting us, like most final lines of poems do. His terror's touchy dynamite. The alliteration, the hard consonant sounds, terror touchy dynamite, definitely are a part of what he's trying to do here. But also take that alliteration, that sound, and attach it to meaning. His terror is like touchy dynamite. Okay? So not just something, you see dynamite there, you're worried it's going to go off at any point, but touchy dynamite, particularly, it's liable to explode at any moment. I think at the end, ask yourself that question. What happens if it goes off? Okay? What's being led towards us? Is it consequences for him, for others, whatever? Is it something that's broader? Okay, so that's the 3 stanzas. Now let's form and layout and think about the impact of the choices that are being made. Right, first of all, this isn't first person. Even though we are entirely in the head and vision of the soldier himself. Oreo's just started barking there in the background. He never uses first person. So there is a sense of distance there. Now the 3 stanzas all deal with something very different. I would identify them, or have identified them as, the first one is about the act of running. The second is about his thought process and time in general. And the third is come back to reality and terror. But there's a enjambment across. And you think to yourself, well, if they're so separate, why do they run into each other? We mentioned this idea of the stanza length before, particularly the interruption, the third, and the fact that the poem appears to begin in the middle of something. So if you pull all that together, we've got an element of distance, but of also being in the moment. We've got an element of control to the format, but a slight chaos within it and panic within it as well. And then that leads us to this dramatic moment with no clear outcome at the end. I think that is a very good place to start in thinking about Hughes's intentions in this poem as a whole. And that naturally leads us on to, first of all, war itself. Have a think about how and why Hughes contrasts the unrealistic patriotic expectations of the soldier, probably in the First World War, with the reality of being in the middle of the conflict. Something that we identified very, very early on, and potentially even to an element in the title, to a degree in the title. Okay, so that contrast is at the heart of it. The fact that even though this is a single event, a few seconds really, the impact of the war on his life is made clear throughout the poem, especially in the second stanza. So he's kind of taken a small few seconds in the middle of one bayonet charge to one person, and he has suggested the way that it impacts on the broader life of somebody. And then, as we mentioned, as we said before, the enemy is never mentioned in the poem, and there's an interesting comparison there to what happens in Owen's poem Exposure, where the enemy is mentioned, but they're in the distance, and like a dull rumour of war, as he says at one point. Now, we've mentioned isolation a lot through it as well. So think of that idea. This is a large number of people, but it just focuses on the one soldier, and he repeatedly stresses the individuality of the experience. No other humans as well. And then we move on to emotional impact. The emotional journey the soldier goes on. Fear, horror, terror. The figurative language. Definitely something that I would say to use at the heart of an answer on this. I mean, personally, if I was writing about this, I think I'd come to it through the ideas and how they're established overall, and how the form and the structure of it is directing us towards that. And then I would come into the figurative language and the way that is being used.